This is Vanessa Gorman. Today I will introduce you to nouns and articles, and this video is intended to talk about how Greek nouns and articles function using English terms and not give you any of the Greek forms yet. So first we need to start by asking, what is a noun? And that's a question that baffles linguists. It's very, very difficult to give a concise, specific definition, but the oversimplified definition works for most of us, which is to say, a word used to describe a person, place, thing, or idea. Again, it's not very sophisticated, but most of us, this is enough. And we can further divide nouns into types. So, for example, proper nouns are those used to describe a unique person or place. And these are the ones that we capitalize in English, like Persia or Pericles or the Peloponnesian War. There are also the vast majority of nouns, which are common nouns, describing persons, places in general, not a specific one. So we have a contrast between common nouns and proper nouns. There's another contrast between concrete and abstract nouns. So concrete nouns are things that you can perceive with your senses, whereas abstract nouns are things that you conceive of in your mind. So the difference between a table and hope, for example, a book and peace. We also talk about collective nouns, nouns that refer to a group of things like a class of students, a grove of trees. So these are all important to understand these terms when we're talking about specific nouns. Now, just to see how we're doing, let's begin in English by just identifying which words in here are nouns. So pause it for a minute until you've decided which of all these words are nouns. Well, if you chose out all of the underlined words, then you have done quite well. So these are the words that are nouns. Nouns have characteristics in Greek. Greek is uninflected language. That means the nouns change their forms depending on what they do in the sentence. In English, we hardly decline nouns at all, other than using different forms for the plural and different forms for possessives. English just isn't very inflected, whereas Greek is very much inflected. And so the characteristics of a normal noun are that it has number, gender, and case. And nouns are declined. Verbs are conjugated, nouns are declined. Number, gender, and case. Number means simply singular or plural, although Greek also has a sneaky little number called dual. Doesn't show up very often. It refers to when two people or two things are acting. It will show up very, very rarely, more in poetry than in prose, but be aware. By gender, we simply mean masculine, feminine, or neuter. Now, the gender of a word isn't necessarily obvious by its meaning, just like in gendered languages today, for example, German. It also has a case, and there are 4 common cases in Greek. There's a 5th that will show up later, the vocative, but we'll not worry about that too much right now. Nominative singular is the form you're going to see in the dictionary. Comes from the Latin word for name, nomen. Nominative has the idea that it's the subject of a finite verb. It could also be used as a predicative nominative after a copular verb. So Ralph is an elephant. Both Ralph and elephant are nouns. Ralph is the subject, elephant is the pronoun, the predicate nominative. Copular verbs, remember, are things like is or becomes. So which nouns in this passage would be in the nominative? Which nouns are subjects or predicate nominatives? Now, I've underlined the ones that qualify. So Tissaphernes came. So Tissaphernes is the subject of the verb came. Alcibiades is the subject of the word went. Tissaphernes is the subject of the verb seized. Here's a tricky one. saying that the king ordered him. The king is the subject of ordered, even though it's an indirect statement saying that. We'll come to those much later in the course. Alcibiades and Mantitheus provided themselves with horses. So again, these are all subjects of various conjugated verbs. There's also one pronoun in here. He had been taken prisoner. He was prisoner. He was made into a prisoner. And so that would qualify as a nominative, as a pronoun in this case. All right, what about the accusative case? The accusative case is usually used for, most commonly used for the direct object. I don't want to say usually. It's probably the second most common case used because it is used so simply for the direct object. And I will tell you, I'm only giving you the most common uses. I'm not going to give you every single use that ever was. You can find that in a grammar book. But the most common use is direct object. I give a book. I mowed the lawn. I drove the car. It's also used in time statements for the extent of time. He stayed for 7 days. You don't need the preposition for in Greek. You just use the word 7 days and put them into the accusative, and that gives you what's called the extent of time or duration of time. Likewise, space is the same thing. If you want to give the distance someone has traveled, they traveled 70 stades. That would be in the accusative, not as a direct object, but as the extent of space. Both of those would be labeled as adverbs in a sentence tree because they're not a necessary argument. The direct object is a necessary argument. Place to which he sailed to Ephesus. Very, very common. Accusative will take the place to which, usually with some kind of preposition, as we'll see. Adverbial accusative. You can just take a word, particularly an adjective when we get to them, put it in the accusative case and translate it as an adverb. So, for example, if you want to say first, he said, you can just take the word first and put it in the accusative. In the end, he spoke. You can do the same kind of thing. So a cheap and easy way to make an adverb is simply to take an accusative and stick it and just leave it in the sentence without any fit into the sentence in a way that is necessary, but is simply acting as an adverb. So looking at the accusatives in this passage, which ones do you think would be in the accusative? Well, the Hellespont, because you come to the Hellespont, you can't come without there is a place to which you are coming. So that's the direct object. You're carrying or bearing offerings and gifts. So those are direct objects. Sorry, one is place to which, not direct object. He ordered him to make war. That's a simple direct object. They provided horses, and they made their escape, and they went to Clazomenai. So these are all either direct objects or place to which. These are things that would always be placed in the accusative in Greek. There's a genitive case, and the genitive has a lot of uses, but the good news is you can usually get away with translating it with the word of. At its heart, genitive is possessive. So Pete's book, The Book of Pete, that's the most common use of the genitive, is simply a kind of a possessive. But there are also a lot of other things that we can translate with the word of that have this sense of, for example, material, a piece of pie, which could be material, what the piece is made out of, or it could be partitive, that is the part of a whole, right? 1 out of 3 people. So you can say a piece of wood, you can say, a ship of pine timbers. So material or partitive is very, very common. We also use genitive to express quality or price. and we can say this in English a little more roundabout way, a woman of good character or a bribe of 60 drachmas. Um, we likewise use genitive often for charges or penalties of the charge. In legal context, the penalty of exile, you charge someone in the accusative with something in the genitive. We also have a comparison. If you want to say Adam is taller than Fred, you can just take Fred and throw it into the genitive. And if it's next to a comparative, an ER form of an adjective, then you know that that genitive is going to be comparison. There's a very common genitive of cause with words like envy or admire or hate or pity. I am envious of your new car. I admire your new car, right? I am piteous of your new car. There is the genitive of separation or place from which or source, it's sometimes called. If you're leaving from some place or if you're derived from something, it's going to be placed in the genitive. Likewise, it's used temporally for time or place within which, so temporally or spatially. So during the summer, in the next few hours, during the day, in Caria, you can use the genitive to have this concept of within which, time or place within which. So looking back at our old familiar passage, which of these nouns would be in the genitive? Well, frankly, not too many. We have place from which, from Sardis, and the time during which, by night. So those two words would be thrown into the genitive here. We don't have any possessives, which is kind of unusual. So there's three of the cases. The last major case is the dative case, and the dative is a kind of catch-all for lots of things. It's commonly thought of as the case used for the indirect object, the to or for. So John gave a gift to Charlie. John is the subject. A gift is the direct object. To Charlie is the indirect object, but it is still a necessary argument of the verb. Instrument means an accompaniment. So with what? In other words, that's how you have to think about it. With what? He marched in with an army, accompanied by an army. The king was killed by a javelin, by means of a javelin, or the instrument of his death was a javelin. We also have what's called the locative or place where. Dative is this case for things that are stationary. So he was born in Ephesus. Her friends found her at home. Place where, and likewise time when. On the next day he departed for home. So locative or place where, time when are the two very, very common ones. Frankly, all four of these are very common. A fifth use that isn't as common is something called the degree of difference, which again is a dative accompanying a comparative like later or longer. If it's in the genitive, it's a genitive of comparison, later than someone, longer than someone. If it's in the dative, it's by how much, degree of difference, later by 7 days, longer by a mile. So you will see genitives and datives next to comparatives doing different things. So which of these nouns left would be dative? Well, went to visit him with a single trireme is accompaniment. And then imprisoned him in Sardis is a place where, and took him prison in Caria. Okay, in Caria, I've put it in twice now. It could be extent of place, or it could be place where. It's probably place where. You'd have to look at the Greek. They could do it more than one way, just like many things can be expressed more than one way. There's also indirect objects, the Athenians. Make war on the Athenians. So you're making war, direct object, on the Athenians, indirect object. There are also some degree of difference in here. 30 days later. So later by 30 days. That's also going to be in the dative. So a good rule of thumb for you is, when it comes to place and time, this is a chart that's useful to know. Dative, place where, time when. That's easy. The spatial ones are pretty easy. Genitive is out of, dative is where, Accusative is where to. Time is a little harder to keep track of. Genitive is the extent, how long it lasts, and accusative is within which. So there's the case uses in Greek. Now, I want to talk also about the article, because you don't do nouns without talking about articles. By articles, I mean the word the. Greek has no indefinite article, the word a or an. You can use their word the to say a. I mean, it's not as distinguished in Greek. So if we have the man, it could be a man. And you just have to decide from the context what the best translation is. Technically, articles are adjectives. Greek generally treats them as a separate part of speech, and so will we, because it's just easier to speak of them separately. So articles technically are adjectives. They're going to act like adjectives, in other words. They must match the noun they modify in number, gender, and case. That doesn't mean their endings are going to match, as we'll see, but they have to be, if the noun the article is modifying is singular, feminine, dative, the article must be singular, feminine, dative. There's just no exceptions to that. And they don't need to be immediately preceding their noun. And we're going to see that because a lot of times they will be used to bookend modifiers for the noun. So let's go back into our passage that we know so well by now. Which of these words are articles and which nouns do they modify? Well, the Hellespont, the king, the Athenians, and also a is the indefinite article. So now you should have a pretty good feel for what nouns are and what articles are and what the different cases do. Now we've got to take these ideas and apply them to Greek.